Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm doing a portrait of Robert Downey Jr. in colored pencil. There's a nice contrast between the shadow side and the light side of the face. So let's see how it was done. Before I start, when I'm examining the reference photo, I usually make a small selection of colors that I'm going to be using, and I just lay down a bunch of pencils there on my desk. It's usually around a dozen or at least a dozen pencils. Sometimes I use more, sometimes less. Sometimes I end up using fewer pencils than I initially predicted. But here, one of the things that's going to be helping me a little bit is the color of the paper. And by the way, I'm using a 1000 grit sandpaper, and the pencils I'm using are Faber Castell Polychromos color pencils. Now when it comes to sandpaper, there's a limited selection of colors. It's usually grayish, and I have one that is plain gray, and this one is more bluish. And I picked this bluish one because I'm going to have some bluish tones in the background, as well as some bluish or rather cooler tones in the shadow side of the face. So I thought that this bluish paper would actually help me out a little bit with those cooler tones. So for some of the initial lines here where I went over the sketch, I used some of the darker pencils, dark sepia and some other darker browns. And for the background, I'm mostly going to be using some bluish colors. Now in the eye here, as you can see, I put in some catch lights using a white colored pencil, and then just sort of worked around that with some darker colors. So this is just a regular sandpaper, or it is waterproof sandpaper, but it's a finer grit, and it's a surface that I like to use with colored pencils. Now for some of these lighter parts of the face, like for example this light side of the nose on the right, I'm going to use a very light color. This is a light beige red. And I'm telling you the names of the pencils I'm using. I don't know their exact numbers, and honestly I can't be bothered to write them down. After all, many people don't use Faber Castell Polychromos. You may be using some other brand, so if you're drawing something similar, you will just want to approximate and find something similar. The reference will be in the description if you want to check that out. And if you check it out, you will see that the light side is on the right. So the light source is coming more from the right side. The shadow side is on the left. That's the shadow side of the face, the darker side of the face. However, we will have some very interesting highlights on the left side as well because of the reflected light. This will make this portrait more interesting and also kind of more three-dimensional, because it will be these shadows and these contrasts that will actually help me explain the shape of the main subject's face to the viewer, and also create that illusion of depth and volume. For the darker parts of the face, for the darker tones in the skin, I'm going to use this dull reddish. There's a lovely catch light. There's a lovely highlight there on the tip of the ear, all the way on the left, because that part of the ear is going to be lighter because of the reflected light. Now for the darker part of the ear and the face, I used caput mortem, which is like a dull reddish brown, and I'm going to be working on top of that with some lighter colors, mostly the cinnamon and the light beige, but I'm going to be adding some warmer colors on top of that as needed, because in combination with this paper, these two might actually be a little bit too cool for a skin color. So we'll see. For the darker parts of the hair, this part of the hair which is closer to the scalp and further away from the light source, I'm going to use some black and some dark sepia. This dark sepia is very useful for some of the darker tones on my portrait because it's not exactly black, it's kind of like a more rich saturated color with a little bit of I suppose brownish and grayish tones in there. But I can also use black and combine it with other colors. For example, I used a little bit of black on the background here because I wanted to enhance the contrast between the background and the main subject. Now let me talk a little bit about the background. First I'm going to use a bit of this dark indigo color, and that's going to be one of the darkest colors I'm going to use for the background, and one of the darkest colors I'm going to use in this whole drawing. And I'm going to be using some lighter blues in combination with that as well. So as I've already mentioned, the background color of the paper is helping me a little bit because I already have some bluish tones, and I'm just going to be adding some different types of blues and some darker and lighter tones on top of that. Now here in this case the background is still blurry and out of focus, as is the case with all of the previous colored pencil portraits I did. But here we have just a few more suggestions of shapes here and there, because the scene obviously takes place indoors, and we have some suggestions of some panels and windows and even a small light source on the right, as you will see. So I don't need to draw any specific shapes. I'm just drawing these blurry out of focus shapes because, again, I want to create an out of focus blurry background just like I did with all the previous colored pencil portraits. But one of the things that I always pay attention to is the selection of colors for the background, because I'm going to want as well as the face of my main subject, because I'm going to want the face to reflect the overall atmosphere, the overall lighting where the scene takes place. For blending, as you can see, I'm using brushes and blending stumps, as well as my fingers here and there, and these blending tools seem to be doing the trick. Now, the only reason why I can use them the way I'm using them here is because I'm working on sandpaper. On regular paper, these wouldn't work quite as well. For this light source here to the right, I first used some slightly darker and warmer colors around the edge, and then in the middle I started filling that in with some lighter and lighter colors. First some ivory colored pencil, and then in the very middle some white colored pencil, which is the lightest, and then just working around that and blending to make that look blurry and out of focus, just like some light source which is kind of glowing in the background. And I'm just working with a blending stump as well as my brushes to try to make everything look blurry, and so that I can avoid texture which would compete with the details and the textures on my main subject, because I want the main subject to stand out against the background. So here I'm working on the edge of the main subject's head, and you can see that on top of that, on top of those darker colors that I used for the hair, I'm using some lighter colors. I'm actually going to use some cinnamon, which I'm going to be using for the skin, and that's going to be my highlight color for the hair. The hair here appears lighter and a bit more reddish and purplish at the top because of the lighting. A few more words about the background. So if you want to create that out of focus background, it's important to remember not to create clean edges. So if you want a bokeh out of focus background, just create blurry shape and blurry edges, and sometimes double edges. Kind of like the way you see things when you cross your eyes or when you're drunk. So that's the key to creating out of focus backgrounds. Obviously on the main subject I'm going to want to achieve the complete opposite. I'm going to want to create clean edges, some stronger contrasts, and more detailed textures. So as you can see, at the bottom of the hair, closer to the forehead area, closer to the scalp area, I used some darker tones, and then on top of that, at the top, I used some lighter colors for those highlights where the hair is catching some light from the light sources. For the shadow side of the face, I'm using this Caput Mortem. 169, I believe, is the number of the pencil. And then on top of that, I'm going to be working with some lighter pencils. First, I'm going to define this shadow side of the face by shading all of the shadow side of the face. And once that is done, I'm going to apply some lighter colors on top of that, mainly the cinnamon colored pencil and also some light beige red. And you can also see that I didn't use the exact same amount of that darker color in every part of the face. So I worked on top of that Caput Mortem with that lighter cinnamon color and kind of blended these two together, and now I'm back to using some darker colors to refine some of the darker details around the eyebrows and the general eye socket area. For the whites of the eye, I'm going to use some lighter colors. First, a little bit of this light beige, and then some cooler colors, just so that his eyes wouldn't look bloodshot, but they do have to pick up a little bit of those reddish tones from the environment. So here I'm just trying to define the shape of the eyes and adding some eyelashes here and there. These are just some of the smaller details, but probably the most important part of the eye, I suppose, is that contrast between the iris and the white of the eye, and of course the iris, the pupil, and the catch lights in the eye itself. There is a very subtle contrast or very subtle transition between the pupil and the rest of the iris, because his pupils are rather dark and large here, and the rest of the iris looks fairly dark, but it's still there. Now for this light side of the face, as you can see, I used some light beige red, which is going to be one of the lightest colors I'm going to use on this drawing. And you can see that now that I'm starting to use those lighter colors all the way on the right side, how much contrast I'm getting between the light side of the face and the shadow side of the face. It's important to define those larger contrasts. I like to work, you can work from details to larger relationships, or you can start with the larger relationships and then go in with the details. I like to use a combination of the two approaches, and sometimes I put in a few details just to have those in place, and then I shade the larger parts of the face, establishing those larger contrasts and trying to define the overall topography of the face. And then after that, I move in with the refining of the details and adding some textures on top. I'm using even an ivory colored pencil for some of the lightest bits on the face, and I'm also adding a touch of this orange. This is a cadmium orange. I'm adding a touch of that to some parts of the face here, especially around the middle, where I felt the colors were a little bit too cool and I needed something a bit warmer, a bit more lively, and a bit more lifelike. So I decided to make the overall color of the face just a little bit warmer, and this cadmium orange helped a lot here. And I'm just going back and enhancing the contrast between this dark part of the hair and the face. Now I'm on to refining some of the textures and smaller details on the face, as well as the shape of the hairline around the sides of the face, the sideburns, and things like that. Going over this shadow side of the face, adding a little bit of the magenta, and then adding a touch of this pinkish color all the way on the left side, because remember I said that there would be some reflected light coming from the other side. So even though the left side is the shadow side, some parts of that shadow side are going to appear just a little bit lighter than others because of that reflected light, which is why I added a bit of pink colored pencil around some of those areas on the left. It's very important to get the shape of the nose to look right. That's why this contrast between the light side of the nose and the rest of the face was so important to me, and that's why I pulled that line of the light side of the nose at the very beginning, if you remember, with that light beige color. And after that, it's easier to work on the details and to define the rest of the shapes around the nose. So it's mostly a combination of a cinnamon and a light beige now as I'm refining the shape of the face. I usually like to work from dark to light when shading the face and drawing the hair as well, but sometimes I need to go from light to dark as well. Sometimes if I feel like some areas need a little bit more shadow, need some darker colors, I'll just go back and add some darker colors on top of that. And adding darker colors on top of the lighter areas is also a good way of adding some texture and making the skin appear more realistic. I don't really know how much the camera will be able to pick up on these tiny details like those textures, but it doesn't really matter because I think we're mostly interested in the larger contrasts here. Here I added a bit of those skin tones to the chin and the jaw area because I can't just draw this goatee using those darker colors. I'm mostly going to use this dark sepia and a black colored pencil again, but I need to make it look like it's growing on top of actual skin. That's why I had to put in some lighter colors first, so that these hairs growing out would appear more natural. And of course I can't forget about the contrast between the light side and the shadow side on this lower part of the face as well. So here I'm moving on with the clothes, adding some shadow areas on the collar. He has a grey shirt, and now I'm going to do a bit of larger shading on the neck. I'm just fixing the edges of the neck, doing a little bit of blending, and now defining the lighter and darker portions of the neck. There's going to be some nice shadows here as well. Here and there I can skip from one part of the portrait to the other and go back and refine some details. I felt that I needed some warmer colors again, so on the light side of the face I added this yellowish orange, and I think it's making the skin appear a bit more natural. Like I said, we have some cooler tones overall, but I also want the contrast between the shadow side and the light side of the face, and I want those cooler, darker tones, more pinkish and purplish tones on the left, on the shadow side of the face. So I want to establish a contrast not just in terms of value, but also in terms of the temperature of the colors. I think that will make this portrait even more interesting. Now in some of the lightest bits, some of the lightest parts of the portrait on the right side, on the light side, I even added a touch of ivory colored pencil. I'm just refining the shadows on the neck here, and also again adding a touch of this orange to make some portions of it a bit warmer, adding some shadows, but I still need to make it clear where the jaw ends and the neck begins, and that's why I made sure that the bottom part of that goatee was a little bit darker, which is why I used a bit of a black colored pencil on top of that dark sepia. Just a few lighter bits here around the Adam's apple, and here I messed up a part of the background all the way on the right, and now I'm just kind of repairing that. Fully putting down some finishing touches on the light side of the face and cleaning up some parts of the background before I move on to finish the rest of the portrait and to draw his clothes. Just a few light folds here on his shirt. And now for the jacket, this is just like some lighter details here, and I'm going to use some light grey and white colored pencil for these metal parts here. So for this jacket, or whatever it is that he's wearing, first I'm going to establish some shadow areas using a black colored pencil, and then on top of that I'm going to use the purplish and magenta tones, as well as some caput mortuum, which I use on the face. On the right side, I'm going to use a little bit less of that black shadow color, and I'm going to allow a bit more of those reddish tones to break through. Now, as you can see, believe it or not, I am blending with my finger here. I'm blending this large area with my finger, and of course you wouldn't even think about doing this with your fingers on regular paper, but on sanded paper you can do this because the texture of the paper is such that it grinds on the pencil and it creates more material that you can move around. So colored pencils behave a bit more like pastel pencils on this type of surface. Just adding some of these warmer, richer tones on top of the darker black areas so that they wouldn't appear too dull, and so that this transition between the light side and the shadow side would look more natural. And adding some nice highlights here where this part of the shirt or this part of the jacket is catching a bit more light from the light source, so that I can make those folds around the neck appear more three-dimensional, because that range of value is always important if you want to create that illusion of depth and volume. Now I think the drawing is done, and I'm just going to use this bluish, light bluish turquoise color to draw my signature on the right side of the drawing in the lower right corner. And that, I think, would be it. As always, if you like my content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Check out my other videos. I have tons of other portraits, landscapes, etc. And if you want to see full-length videos, more content, more narration, you should check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.